Rod Sims is the longest serving chair of Australia's Competition and Consumer Commission. He's also one of the key architects of Australia's News Media Bargaining Code, a regulation that has achieved what was once thought impossible, forcing Facebook and Google to pay substantial sums of money to media groups for using news content. Following a new law enacted in February, the big technology platforms have agreed deals to pay an estimated $200 million a year to large and small publishers, begging the question of whether this regulatory approach could become a template for other countries to follow. So welcome, Rod. I think the first question really is, why did you feel this code was actually necessary?
Thanks, Jamie, and thanks to the Financial Times for allowing me to do this. Really appreciate the opportunity. The reason we felt the code was necessary was that there is a clear market power imbalance between, on the one hand, Google and Facebook, which are near monopolies or very close to monopolies on the one hand, and the media companies on the other. It is impossible to do a commercial deal with a monopoly. It's basically take it or leave it terms. As we all know, particularly clear in Australia, Facebook and Google have inserted themselves between users of the internet and the internet. They grab content and don't pay for it. They provide wonderful products to users for free and make money out of the data they get hold of, which they then use for advertising. It is a brilliant business model, but it means that the content they're getting from journalists is not being paid for. We believe if you had a competitive market, it would be. That constitutes the market failure. There's many market failures in society, but this one matters because journalism, the fourth estate, is so fundamental to the proper functioning of our society that this is a market failure that must be addressed, and the Media Bargaining Code does that. So that's the reason for the code.
So Rod, it was quite a complex piece of legislation. Can you really outline the key features of the code and how they work?
So the code is what we in Australia would call light-handed regulation. It's basically a negotiate arbitrate model, meaning that the parties are required to negotiate. If they can't get agreement, then there's arbitration. And what that arrangement does, it obviously only works when you've got sizable players on both sides, but what it does, because both sides don't want to go to arbitration, then you lose control of what's going on. It does actually even up the bargaining power, and you get deals, very often you get deals done without the need to revert to arbitration. So it solves the problem of evening up the bargaining power imbalance. Now, this is a mechanism that dates back nearly 30 years in Australia when we had a very famous review of competition policy led by Fred Hilmer. I was heavily involved in all that 30 years ago, and it wrestled with whether the misuse of market power provision, the unilateral conduct provision, could be used when you've got, for example, 30 years ago, we had a telecommunications monopoly. It owned the copper wire. We were trying to get other retailers to retail telecommunications in competition with the monopoly, but of course they needed access to that copper wire to provide the service. So rather than do it by continually taking action against them after the event through competition law, we came up with the idea of ex ante regulation, where our incumbent monopoly had to negotiate, and if they couldn't agree with the new entrants for the terms to the copper wire, they would go to arbitration. So that's the philosophical beginnings of this approach. It's an approach much used in Australia. The key mechanisms within that approach are, firstly, arbitration. That's absolutely fundamental to the model. That's what evens up the bargaining power. And secondly, that if you do a deal with one media company, you've got to do a deal with all, in the sense that you can't discriminate. So this is not a must-carry regime. Facebook and Google can decide to carry news or not, but if they carry any news, including international news, then they must be caught by the bargaining code. So those two fundamental, arbitration and the non-discrimination, as I've just described it, are the key provisions, but it builds on a philosophy that we've had here for some time.
Now, if Facebook and Google would not agree with your idea that it is light-handed regulation, and they would point to this baseball-style arbitration at the heart of it, where whenever both parties put forward a amount of money that was to be agreed in a deal, there's a choice of either or, rather than some arbitrator coming into the middle. I mean, how is that fair, this baseball-style arbitration? Is that really in use in Australia, in other sectors?
It has not been used in Australia before. It is used in Canada. We talk to them a lot. It's used by their telecommunications regulator. The reason we came up with it, because our media companies were thinking the amount they should get paid was somewhere way over there. The digital platforms felt the amount they should pay is somewhere over there. The gap was just enormous. Trying to work out the value of journalism, news media journalism, to Google and Facebook is complex. We felt, therefore, the better way to do it was to let both sides put in a bid and let the arbitrators choose which bid is the most appropriate one. Now, they do have discretion to vary it, but that would be an exception. And what that does is it immediately takes out of the equation the ambit claims. You've got to come together. Otherwise, if you're out there in an ambit, you won't get your bid up. So it forces parties to get realistic. I don't think it favours one side or the other. It just means you're very likely to avoid the ambit claims to make this a much more workable form of arbitration.
So in February, Facebook pulled all Australian news off its platform. It was quite a dramatic development. Were you surprised by that?
Oh, yes, I was. But just stepping back, we'd been dealing with Facebook and Google since July last year, and they had been, well, earlier than that actually, but the first draft of the legislation came out in July. They did not like it. Google was saying, well, if this goes ahead, we'll leave Australia, we'll withdraw search from Australia. Facebook was saying, we just don't want anything to do with this. So in the so we knew that they had fairly fundamental problems. We also knew that this is, we understand this is a high stakes game when we're trying to get them to do something they don't want to do. So we understood they'd be making quite strong statements against it. And we understood that they were thinking about whether they'd stay in Australia, the form they'd stay in Australia. But waking up one morning and find that Facebook had taken all news off their platform, they'd taken all emergency services off their platform, they'd taken off the platform advice on health, which was a strange time to do it. It was just incredibly broad. So I was surprised that they did it without warning. I was surprised they did it way in excess of what they needed to do if they wanted to avoid the news bargaining code. My own view is they sort of overshot and did themselves a bit of harm.
So there followed a week of high stakes negotiations between the Australian Treasurer and Mark Zuckerberg over the code. And then there was a compromise come to. Could you just explain the compromise? Because as I understand it, the code isn't in place unless the Treasurer designates the company. So what's happening there?
So there was also issues with Google before that, where the Treasurer was negotiating with the Chief Executive of Alphabet, and that was an exciting time. And that was all to do with the arbitration criteria, and that got sorted out. With Facebook, the main concession was they just wanted more time, but before arbitration got put in place, more time before the Treasurer would designate. And I think the Treasurer felt that, and I agree, that Google and Facebook just do not want designation. So basically, if they want to do deals, if they do deals, fair commercial deals with media companies, then there's no need for designation because the purpose has been achieved. So if I could just restate that, the whole purpose of the code is to address the problem of an imbalance in bargaining power. If you address that, you get fairly even bargaining power, you get good commercial deals, well, you don't need to go to arbitration. But it also follows you don't actually need to designate either. The legislation has done its job. So designation was never the objective, arbitration was never the objective, good commercial, fair deals was the objective of the legislation, and that's being achieved, so we're very comfortable with the outcome.
So do you think that other jurisdictions can follow Australia's lead by using competition law in this way? And why didn't you go the French route and the EU route of using copyright legislation?
So I'll deal with those in reverse order. So we didn't go with copyright because that just gets awfully complicated as to what is copyright and what is not copyright. And what we judged the problem to be was the imbalance in bargaining power, which we see a lot in Australia. For example, you've got a whole lot of companies that need to use a port, which is a monopoly. There's only one port you can use, and so they need some leverage to get a fair port charge out of the port. And so this legislation, the principle that we're talking here, can also be used there: negotiate, arbitrate. So the issue is that if, in terms of other countries, there's no reason why any country can't adopt what we've done in Australia. No reason at all. It's in a sense easier for us because that's a negotiate arbitrate model is quite common in Australia. So we're really just adapting a model which is used in relation to dealing with monopoly infrastructure. The second issue is with copyright, it's just awfully complicated. And as I say, the problem is the imbalance in bargaining power, not a copyright problem in our view. So we just said, what's the problem? What's the solution? Sorry, I got a bit tangled up between the first and second there, but I think I've answered the question. This addresses what we saw the problem to be, and it draws on mechanisms that are tried and true here in Australia. But to go back to your question, there's no reason why other countries can't do the same thing.
Okay, I'll go to the audience. Have put forward a couple of questions. A few of them deal with the News Corp and Murdoch Group. And one of the criticisms of this code has been that it's been a bailout for Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, which is a strong supporter of the Australian government. For example, it was the only company to suggest this baseball-style arbitration. So did politics play a role in this?
Oh, look, I think the line Google has been running for a very long time is that, they sent emails to all parliamentarians quite a lot, or they were behind them saying, don't let big business control the internet. And they were, of course, referring to News Corp. But of course, News Corp is 1% the size of Google. So yes, big business does control the internet, and they're called Google. This whole notion that this is about News Corp is extremely strange. I realise internationally, News Corp has been running this line because they're the main international news media company that's in Australia. But News Corp is one of four main media companies. It's, very likely not the one with the biggest reach. There's probably a couple of others that have got a bigger reach than News Corp. And then we've got a whole lot of mid-tier media companies and a whole lot of small media companies. It's true that News Corp advanced the idea of the baseball final offer arbitration. That's true. But that only came when we adopted a very different model to what News Corp suggested. So we had models from News Corp, we had models from Nine, which is one of the other major media companies. They own one of the two main commercial TV stations. They own the only national Financial Times equivalent. They own the main papers in Sydney and Melbourne, and they own the main commercial radio network. They had a big influence on the ideas they put forward. The Guardian put a whole lot of ideas forward as well, and the Guardian is here through a very prominent offshoot called Guardian Australia. So there were many people giving us ideas. News Corp was but one. And in terms of my interaction, and I suspect the government's, but I don't know, but my interaction, I spent more time with companies other than News Corp than I did with News Corp. So I just think this is a line put out by Google. Look, News Corp doesn't have a monopoly on press in Australia. It's one of four players. And there's 12 or 13 media companies that have got deals out of this. Obviously, the media supports the bargaining code. All the media support it. News Corp supports it. So does Nine. So does the ABC. So does Seven West. A whole lot of people. The Guardian Australia is a very strong supporter and said so to many parliamentary committees. So I think that's a bit of a Google urban myth, that line. But look, let's just be clear here. Do politicians respond to what media companies want? I mean, politicians are responsive to media companies. They're responsive to many media companies because the media portrays them to the public. So the fact that this was the media certainly did no harm to the bill's chance of getting passed. But to focus all on News Corp is a very strange way to do things.
One of the things that's happened is that because there's no designation of Facebook or Google yet, there's no transparency over the deals. So there could be a concern that smaller media companies might be losing out. We don't know what's going on. And also, there's no mechanism within the legislation to ensure that media groups spend money on journalism. So what's to stop them just giving dividends to their shareholders?
Look, there's 3 points there. One is transparency. These deals were never meant to be transparent. I mean, even if you had designation, you went to arbitration, they were never meant to be transparent, because what's the problem? The problem is the imbalance in bargaining power. The aim was to get commercial deals. And, you know, if they were doing commercial deals and you didn't have this imbalance in bargaining power, you wouldn't see the deals anyway. So the objective was never transparency. Secondly, in relation to small companies, the problem is the imbalance in bargaining power. So you are going to get paid in proportion to your contribution to news media. So, you know, if you've got 100 times more journalists than another player, well, you'll probably get 100 times the amount of money. If you want to help small players in journalism, we in our recent inquiry, digital platform inquiry, recommended that, you know, that's something governments could fund. And governments in Australia spend a lot of money on media. They spend about $1 billion on the Australian Broadcasting Commission. Unlike the BBC, the ABC's funding comes from consolidated revenue. They also provide funding to regional news media, particularly that's covering courts and things like that. They also fund the Newswire service. So there's many other mechanisms. The code was never meant to solve all problems. It was never meant. It was just meant to solve that bargaining power imbalance. And look, how the money's used, it's always a tricky issue. Certainly, there's been announcements by, I'm aware of a number of media companies. Now that I reflect, not sure what's been announced, what hasn't, where they are clearly hiring a lot more journalists as a result of this deal, and that is the buzz in the Australian media sector. What you don't know is how much they would have had to cut back if this money wasn't coming in, because they're all hemorrhaging, as I'm sure they are all around the world. So some of the money might have stopped them doing things they might have otherwise done in terms of cutting back journalism. Some of the money will go to improve journalism. In the end, going back to the problem, had there been commercial deals done, if you were able to do commercial deals, again, it's up to the companies what they do with the money. So we're really solving that bargaining imbalance, that market failure. That's what this is meant to address. I think people load into this a whole lot of other objectives which we never had in mind. But I've no doubt there'll be extra journalists employed, and quite a lot of them in Australia as a result of this code. I already know that's happening in a very big way.
So another question from the audience. What did you make of the way Facebook and Google lobbied compared to other companies or industries that you've taken on?
I've spoken to a number of politicians, or they have spoken to me, saying they have never seen lobbying like they saw from Google and Facebook. I'm not surprised by that. I mean, these are trillion-dollar companies. We don't actually have any of those in Australia. So the biggest companies in the world, and they put on a big effort. They've hired a lot of lobbyists. They've hired a lot of lawyers and a whole range of other things. So, look, I think it was a very strong lobbying effort. Clearly, the media companies as a collective who were in favour of the bill, that obviously helped, going back to your political question earlier, that obviously helped the government hold the line. And yes, the government made what could be termed as concessions to Google and Facebook, but they never varied from the two core principles of arbitration and non-discrimination, which are the fundamentals of the code.
And another one from the audience. So what is the long-term impact, if any, of Australia's stand on such platforms as Facebook and Google? And maybe I could add another element to that. You're taking on big tech in other areas. So maybe could you reflect on that in your answer?
I think that all around the world, there's concern by competition regulators about very large technology companies. I mean, technology has improved competition in so many ways. You can sit in Sydney, where I am now, and buy off stores in London and get it delivered in a matter of days. It's just extraordinary. But there's all sorts of ways in which things that used to constitute a barrier to entry are not anymore. But the rise of the platforms and their clear market power, not just Google and Facebook, but obviously Apple, Amazon, this is a threat to competition, and it's one that competition regulators and politicians are alive to all around the world. So yes, we're doing work on advertising technology, on apps, on choice screens, on a range of digital competition issues. But so, of course, is the CMA in the UK, Andrea Cocelli, who I talk to very regularly. I mean, he is doing a lot of work on that. We're in no way ahead of what the CMA are doing. We're hopefully paralleling them. The European Commission is doing a lot of work on all the things I just mentioned. There's a huge debate going on in the United States about what they're going to do, including mechanisms to help their media companies bargain with Google and Facebook, but also just looking at digital platform issues right across the board. So we're not unique, and I don't think Google and Facebook would feel particularly that we're doing anything different to any other country. So it's an issue that is out there all around the world.
And maybe just very briefly, are you going to look much more closely at mergers now with big tech?
At mergers, did you say?
Yes.
Look, that's an issue. I mean, the large tech companies have done hundreds of acquisitions, which are fundamental. Google's done Android, DoubleClick, YouTube, and none of them have been opposed. So all around the world, competition regulators are looking at how we better assess mergers that are continually going on by technology companies and that do reinforce their market power.
Thanks, Rod, and I'll pass you over to the Financial Times editor, Rula Khalaf, for the next session.